The First Frost, a tale of silent footprints, forgotten love, and the winter that remembers. When memory sleeps beneath the soil and frost awakens the past, a daughter uncovers a mother's hidden truth. Through journal pages, etched stones, and cold mornings, two hearts separated by time find reunion in stillness and snow. The frost arrived early that year, curling its fingers over the land as though it meant to remind it of something long forgotten. It covered the vineyards in a soft, crystalline hush, draping the hills of Erinmore in silver lace. Beneath the dawn light, everything looked fragile and preserved, like a memory encased in glass. The wind held its breath, and even the trees stood still, their last leaves stiff with the cold. Maeve watched it from the edge of the old estate, the hem of her coat brushing the brittle grass. The path behind her was silent, untouched by any recent steps, and in front of her stretched the neglected rows of vines that once flourished under her family's care. They were dry now, twisted into gnarled silhouettes against the frost-bitten earth. But even in decay, they stood with a kind of defiant beauty. She had not returned to this place in 5 winters, not since the funeral, not since the earth itself seemed to close up behind her as she left, unwilling to let the past follow. And yet, here she was, summoned by a single line written on a card with no signature. "The first frost is near, come home." The words had unsettled her, not because they were strange, but because they felt expected, like something unfinished had been waiting all this time. She had left Erinmore thinking she could sever the roots of memory. She had buried her grief under city lights and distractions, under the comfort of forgetting. But the frost, it seemed, was remembered. And it had called her back. The house had changed little, though it had begun to lean toward time in the way old buildings often did. Shutters dangled loose on rusted hinges. The roof bore patches of moss like slow-growing regret. But the structure held, and when Maeve stepped through the doorway, it welcomed her with a silence too deliberate to be accidental. Inside, dust coated everything in a velvet shroud. The furniture had been covered in linen before she left, but time had seeped through the fabric. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, stale air, and the faintest hint of lavender, her mother's scent, though the last of her perfume bottles had long since dried. The hearth, cold and empty, seemed to watch her, as if unsure what she had come to find. Maeve wandered the room slowly. The living room remained frozen in the shape of a family that no longer existed. Her father's reading chair angled toward the window, the mantel still adorned with cracked frames. Her mother's scarf hung over the edge of the dining chair where she always sat untouched, as though left behind in haste. The kitchen smelled of long-forgotten dinners, of burnt rosemary and aging paper. Her old bedroom upstairs still held the bedspread her mother sewed when she was 14. None of it had moved. None of it had dared to change. The stillness was not peace. It was paused, a breath held for too long. Maeve found the journal on her second night, tucked away in the attic under a loose floorboard that creaked louder than the others. She had gone up there looking for nothing in particular, perhaps hoping for distraction, perhaps merely escaping the drafty chill of the lower floors. The attic was full of boxes she hadn't seen since childhood, but the journal wasn't inside any of them. It was buried, wrapped in cloth, and bound in faded red leather that seemed to pulse faintly with the cold. The pages were delicate, the ink faded, but the script was clear and intentional, each letter formed with care. Maeve turned the first few pages cautiously, scanning lines that spoke of the vineyard, of seasons, and of work done under sun and rain. It read like a farmer's diary at first, but the voice was not her father's. It was softer, shaped by emotion as much as observation. Soon the words shifted. What began as notations about soil and yield transformed into something else. Small fragments of longing appeared between harvest notes, mentions of someone unnamed but present. He was there again today, near the elder vines. The way he looks at the land, it's like he remembers it differently than the rest of us. I don't ask for much. Only Frost waits until I have one more day with him. Maeve sat still, her spine pressed against the wooden beams, the journal heavy in her hands. These were her mother's words. There was no doubt. The shape of the sentences and the rhythm of thought were unmistakable. She could hear the timbre of her voice in every sentence. But her mother had never spoken of this man, never spoken of Frost as a symbol for anything other than weather. The words painted the story of a love Maeve had never known existed. Each entry was like a veil being pulled aside. The man was never named, only hinted at in soft metaphors and wistful acknowledgments. He was a laborer, hired to help with the vineyard during a season when labor was cheap and hearts were still unguarded. Maeve's mother, only 20 then, had found him in the rows, working under the waning sun, sleeves rolled to the elbow, skin dusted with ash and grape. She described him not in terms of beauty, but of stillness, like someone who carried the weight of another life. They shared moments small, almost invisible to anyone else, but to her, they had been everything. Their connection deepened over the summer, each day marked not by the passing of time, but by the growing awareness of how little they had left. It was never meant to last. She was the daughter of the land, he was just passing through. There were expectations on her, none on him. They carved out fragments of closeness where they could behind the barrels in the cellar, beneath the old orchard trees, in the quiet after the rain. There were no promises, only the ache of inevitability. When he left, it was without farewell. Maeve read the final entries with a tightness in her chest. Her mother had waited for him, not with hope, but with the resigned kind of patience that belongs to people who have already lost. She wrote about returning to the hill where they had once lain in silence, watching the stars. She wrote of Frost as a symbol of that last night, together with the cold in the air as she watched him walk away, the silver light on his shoulders. "If Frost returns early," she wrote, "I'll know he remembers, and I'll return too." Maeve closed the journal and let her hand rest against the leather cover. The air in the attic was cold, sharp enough to sting. She didn't know what to feel. Her father had loved her mother deeply, but he had never known this part of her. Or if he had buried it alongside the wine casks and harvest tools in the cellar. For days after, Maeve wandered the estate like someone walking through someone else's dream. She moved among the vineyards in silence, retracing the paths described in the journal, seeing the land not through her own eyes, but through the eyes of a woman who had once longed for what she could not keep. The frost remained, crystalline and stubborn. Each morning, it returned heavier than before, painting the windows in feathers of ice. Then, one morning, Maeve found footprints in the frost. Not hers, not an animal, just a pair, narrow and deep, walking from the forest toward the vineyard. They ended near the edge of the hill, the one her mother had described in the journal, then vanished as though the person had taken flight. She stood there for a long time, her breath thick in the air. There was no one in sight, just the vines, half buried in frost and the sky beginning to pale with sunrise. She bent to touch one of the prints. It was fresh, not old, not imagined. Someone had walked there within the hour. Maeve returned to the attic, hands trembling, and opened the journal again. At the back, a page had been added. The ink was newer, the lines unfamiliar. "The frost has come," it read. "I waited on the hill. She did not come. Perhaps it is too late for some returns." Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. Someone else was reading this journal, someone who remembered the frost. She could no longer deny it. This was no longer a simple inheritance of land and home. This was a message, a memory shared through ice. The next day she returned to the hill, carrying the journal. The wind was colder now, and the sky was bruised with winter. She waited beneath the tree her mother had described. No one came. But in the place where the footprints had been, something new waited. A small wooden token, carved into the shape of a leaf, tied with red thread. It was old, familiar. The same thread was used to bind the first pages of the journal. Maeve knelt and picked it up. In the silence that followed, she no longer felt alone. Maeve stood on the frost-laced hilltop, the carved wooden leaf cupped in her gloved hands, its thread curling like a forgotten promise. The morning air hung silent around her, not empty but brimming with meaning, as though the land itself were waiting to exhale. She turned the token over, its surface worn smooth by time. It felt fragile, yet it held a strange gravity, as if it had traveled through winters to arrive in her hands. That night, unable to sleep, she lit a single candle and opened the journal again. The pages, once yellow with age, now contained something alive. She traced the entries with her fingertips, feeling the breath of another presence between the lines. Another hand had written in it, responding not to her mother, but to the frost. And now, to her. There was no name. No indication of who had placed the journal beneath the floorboard or returned to the hill after all these years. Only the sense of someone else carrying the same weight of memory, someone drawn back by a moment that was never allowed to end. Maeve began to suspect the man her mother had once loved had never left entirely, not in the way people vanish, but in the way they linger where they are remembered most deeply. In the following days, she returned to the hill each morning, always arriving just after sunrise. The frost grew thicker with each passing night, crisping the edges of the fields into lace and scattering silver across the vineyard's bones. Her breath came in white clouds, her cheeks numbed, but she didn't mind. The ritual became sacred, her way of stepping into the threshold between then and now. On the seventh morning, she found another set of footprints. This time, they led not from the forest, but from the opposite side, down near the old stream that once divided their land from a neighboring estate. They met her halfway up the hill, side by side for several steps, and stopped at the tree. Beneath its bare limbs, a stone had been placed, a small one, round and white, nestled in the frost like an offering. Etched into its surface, barely visible beneath the rime, was a line. I remember the frost. Maeve bent down and cradled the stone as though it might break. She didn't cry. The tears didn't come. Instead, a deep stillness bloomed inside her, one that held both ache and acceptance. She knew now this wasn't a chance. This was remembrance. Not just hers. Someone else had kept the memory alive. Someone else had loved the frost enough to return to it. The man her mother once knew might still walk these lands, might still breathe this air. He was no longer a figure in a story. He was real and near. That evening, Maeve returned to the attic with the stone and leaf and placed them beside the journal. She pulled a blanket over her shoulders and sat beneath the old rafters, staring at the past laid bare around her. The frost had called her home not simply to discover the story, but to finish it. She began to write. She didn't know where the words came from, only that they had waited, gathering behind the silence. She wrote of her mother's voice, her laughter, and her stillness in the vineyard's golden dusk. She wrote of her father, gentle and dignified, carrying a love that had been complete even with its shadows. She wrote of the frost, how it had marked beginnings and endings alike. And she wrote of the man who left no name, only footprints, tokens, and the ache of a season that had never truly passed. Days blended into nights. The frost thickened until the world outside felt encased in crystal. The vineyard remained quiet, but no longer empty. Word spread through the village that Maeve had returned, that she was tending the land again. No one asked questions. They had known her family too long to pry. Each morning brought new signs, sometimes a feather nestled on the hill's stone bench, sometimes a page tucked in the journal in handwriting not her own. No words, only sketches. The hill, a young woman's silhouette, a frost-covered apple tree long since cut down. These images, faintly drawn in pencil, breathed memory and affection. Someone was speaking through the silence. Maeve never saw who left them, but it no longer mattered. She understood. This was the only way it could be. The frost was a language spoken not aloud but through gesture and grace. Some stories were too sacred to voice. They were meant to be felt in the spaces between. As winter deepened, Maeve walked the vineyard alone. She tended what she could, pruning brittle branches and laying protective soil where roots still clung to life. The land responded slowly, but it did respond. Beneath the crust of frost and silence, life stirred again, and with it, a quiet resolve took hold within her. She would stay, not because of duty, not because of grief, but because she now knew what it meant to belong to a place shaped by love and loss in equal measure. The vineyard was not just land. It was memory held in roots and stone, in the arc of a hill where hearts had once met under moonlight. Spring came slowly to Erinmore that year. The frost clung longer than usual, reluctant to let go. But the thaw began, almost imperceptibly at first. The first green shoots peeked from beneath sleeping vines. The sky softened from pewter to ash blue. One morning, Maeve woke to find the hill clear of frost for the first time in months. She went to it and stood beneath the old tree, the grass damp but green beneath her boots. There, resting at the base of the tree, was one final gift. It was an old wine bottle, dusted and wrapped in cloth. The label was handwritten, barely legible, but unmistakably dated to the year her mother first wrote of the man in the journal. The wax seal bore an emblem. She didn't recognize an interlocking leaf and flame. She brought it back to the house, heart hammering, and placed it beside the journal. Inside the bottle, untouched, the wine was a deep garnet hue, the last of the vintage from a forgotten harvest. Her mother's words returned, "If ever the frost comes early, I will remember, I will return." Maeve never opened the bottle. She didn't need to. Its presence said everything. The frost had not taken it. It had preserved love until it could be honored, not hidden. Years passed. Maeve restored the vineyard, slowly and with reverence. She never spoke publicly of the journal or the man who wrote in it after her. She let the land tell its own story through the fruit it bore and the frost it welcomed each winter. Locals came to know her as quiet but kind, a woman who had learned to listen to the ground beneath her. And every year, when the first frost returned, Maeve would walk to the hill at dawn. Sometimes she brought the journal. Sometimes she brought nothing at all. But always she left something behind. An apple from the orchard she replanted, a stone from the riverbed, or a single wildflower pressed between pages. And every so often a new item would appear in return. A feather, a sketch, a piece of bark carved into a crescent moon. In time, children came to whisper that the hill was magic, that if you visited on the morning of the first frost and left a token, a secret might find you. Maeve never corrected them. She only smiled and returned to her pruning, hands steady, eyes filled with the memory of silver mornings and unspoken love. She lived long, quietly, and content, with the hill and its silent messages always near. And when her time finally came, the frost arrived early that year. It crept gently across the vineyard, brushing each vine with light. It covered the path to the hill in delicate white. And beneath the old tree, on the morning after she passed, two sets of footprints were found side by side, leading into the mist. No one saw who had come, but they didn't need to. The land knew, and it was remembered.